Hi, this is Judah from SceneForge, and in this video I want to talk about the changes and improvements that are coming to 0.1.7 beta of SceneForge that should be available by the time you're watching this video. So these changes mostly occur and are about the visual settings, including reflections and the fog, as you'll see in a second. And I also want to talk about a couple things that you might have seen in the previous video that I didn't give much of an explanation for, so hopefully this video will help clear things up. So to start, the biggest change is we now have the option to adjust the fog in a much more detailed way. So previously, so we have a whole new setting over here, but previously, if you set the fog option to any preset that has fog, so for example, foggy, the fog is very overwhelming, especially if you look towards the sun. It's just, you can't really see what's going on back there. So now we have this option over here to open this up, and we can adjust the four main properties of the fog. So there are two different types of fog. There's distance fog, which is fog that starts at a certain distance, and height fog, which is fog that goes up to a certain height in your scene. So we can adjust the two properties per each of those options. So we have this fog start distance. Now, the lower the value, the closer it starts to the camera. So if I adjust this, you can see the starting line of the fog moving further away. So depending on the look of your scene, it might be desired. Let's fix the aspect ratio. There we go. So depending on the look of your scene, it might be desired to have it closer or further away. Now for the distance fog, we of course can change the intensity. As you can see, it's a little subtle, but we have the option. And we also have the fog height. In foggier environments, height fog is what gives it that look the most, more than distance fog. So that's why it's a much more significant change. So that's just the actual height level, and then you can decrease the intensity of that effect. So now, rather than being overwhelmingly bright, you can kind of adjust what's actually visible, which is super cool. So depending on the weather preset, these values might have a bigger or smaller effect on the scene. So in foggy, where fog is entrenching the entire scene, obviously those values make a difference. But if I go to the clear sky option, where there just isn't as much fog, obviously even if I turn this up all the way, you're not going to have that much of an effect. So other fog influence presets include like more specific weather like rain or snow. You can see now there's fog in the background, and I can adjust it like that and like that. It's really just a personal preference, and it's all about just editing the values to what you think looks good. The other option we have here are in the sky settings is my scattering, M-I-E. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. And so what we can do with that, I'm going to change the time of, or the weather preset and the time of day to something a little better for this. Where's the sun? Here it is. So my scattering is basically, it's caused by pollen, dust, smoke, and water droplets that get stuck in the atmosphere, and that's usually what causes haze around the sun. I'm putting it very simply. There's a lot of much better definitions online with a lot of math and stuff like that. That's worth looking into, but basically what this slider does is it controls the haze around the sun. So it's much more visible in the viewfinder, but if I change to a different weather preset, maybe change the time of day, so the sun is at a different location, you can see the scattering is much more visible. There you go. It's like the haze around the sun. So the other option we added here is tone mapping. Now this is essentially an effect that affects the entire scene and the entire cameras globally. It's basically the process of remapping HDR values to a new range of colors. We have three different options. We have none, which is just the scene as is. We have neutral, which is a much more muted, flat look. Then we have ACEs. Now what ACEs is a standard of tone mapping developed by the Academy. So it's Academy color encoding system, I believe, and it basically looks somewhat like this. So if you're looking for a much more filmic, cinematic look, then ACEs is probably what you're going for. But again, depending on the layout and look that you're going for and the layout of your scene, it's worth just experimenting with these values. So you can see none has a much more blown out HDR, uses HDR effect on the scene around the sun, and as you go from neutral to ACEs, it mutes the colors slightly in different ways. So that's that. I'm going to leave it at none just because that's what we had before. And I happen to like the very bright cartoony effect. So that is the effects we have on the scene lighting, or the scene visuals. Now the other thing we have are now global reflections. So the best example for this is R2-D2's little dome over here. So obviously he's made out of metal, so he should be a shiny boy. And if you go to the previous videos, you'll see that the dome does not have that same level of reflection that we do now. So as I adjust the time of day, you can see the reflection in the dome changes appropriately. And if I change the weather, it'll properly adjust to what is around and above it. So as you can see, it doesn't update every single frame. So if I were to move R2 over just a bit, there's not going to be much of a change until I deselect it and now it updates. Mainly because if it did update every frame, it would be much more taxing on your computer, which we're trying to avoid. So that is global reflections. It updates every time you change a property of the weather, or it updates when you move the active virtual camera a certain distance. So for example, if I, in the viewfinder, walk up to him, let's get a good angle of the dome. If I open up the viewfinder, you can see here, and as I adjust, you can see the change. But if I move the virtual camera further away, you can see the reflection of the camera over here in the dome. As I move it away, every 2 meters that the camera moves, it updates again. So in practice, when you are controlling the camera and actually shooting something, you're not going to notice that much of a difference. That's going to be relatively unnoticeable in practice, but having it update every 2 meters of camera motion just saves a lot of performance. So it looks so much better. It makes the objects look so much more tangible when you have the real reflections on the scene. Now the other option that has been here from the start, but I didn't talk about it much, is ray trace reflections. So if I select the object, we have the option in the properties for ray trace reflections. Now this option is on every object. Of course, depending on the shininess of the materials, it'll have a greater or less effect. So in this example, if I look at his feet over here, you can see we have the specular highlights, but it's not actually reflective. So if I turn this on, there we go. Now we have the reflections turned on and off. Now, unlike the global reflections, these are 100% in real time. So over here, you can see the reflection of the ground. And if I were to change the ground material to something a little more noticeable, you see that it updates in real time appropriately. Now, similar to the lighting that has the ray trace GI option, this is not full RTX reflections. This is a combination of screen space reflections and ray trace reflections. So you get the performance of screen space reflections as well as the limitations of screen space reflections, but the accuracy of ray tracing. So it's not quite RTX, but it is a post effect on top of the image. For most cases, it'll be totally fine and just as good. It really just makes the objects look so much more tangible, as you can see. And C3PO, the material isn't as reflective, but if I turn this on, you can see there are some reflections in the legs. And so if I move these two together a little bit more, you can see that the reflections in each of the objects update properly because this is fully real time and not updated every X seconds or whatever. Of course, it is more taxing on your computer, so just keep that in mind when you're working with it. The other option is Magic Mesh Optimizer. Now, this is something that also was seen in a previous version, but I just didn't show it off. And it basically is a way of optimizing objects in your scene that have a very high polygon count. And what it does, I'll show it just with this R2 over here, is it decimates the model, or it lowers the resolution or complexity of the mesh depending on the distance from the camera. So it's kind of like a very, 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 very simplified version of Unreal Engine's Nanite, just not to the same level of complexity. It's much more simple, but it works pretty well. So for example, if I turn it on for this object, you see when I turn it on, now the mesh is decimated, so it's not as smooth, I guess. And as I move the active camera, which in this case is the editor camera, away from the object, you can see in the viewfinder over here, that the model gets less and less smooth and complex. So it basically removes polygons depending on the distance. But of course, we see it because the camera's focused on it, but in the editor view, because as we move further and away, our little buddy here takes up less and less space on the screen, it's barely noticeable at all. And as we go closer, it readjusts itself back to the higher version. So in this case, because the R2D2 model isn't very high resolution to begin with, it's relatively inexpensive, and it does lower the polygon on the screen, which is great. But if you're working with, let's say, high resolution photo scans that have, hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of polygons, because Magic Mesh Optimizer is such a CPU intensive process, it might actually have the opposite effect and make your editor lag even more. It really depends on your computer and the complexity of the model that you're trying to use. Now, what's important to note is that the active camera switches depending on what mode you're in. So if you're in shoot mode, now the active camera becomes this camera. And because we're kind of exaggerated here, you can see the changes happening. This is something that still needs tweaking. It's an experimental feature, but if you want to play around with it, you can. For most cases, though, I would recommend leaving it off. Play around with it, see what works. Now, the other change that has been made is to the rig lighting that we can bring into the scene. So I'm going to make this darker and change the ground material to something a little more interesting. Let's do that, and let's increase the scaling here. Okay, so we have our environment, and I'm going to import or click Create Lights, and I'm going to bring in a panel light. And here we have our bloom that I'm going to turn down. So in the previous video, or the previous series when I talk about the visual settings and lighting, there was an option to change the power mode from watts to lumens, but that has basically been changed for a more accurate lumen slider. So we got rid of the watts just because it wasn't working as well as we wanted. In the future, we might bring it back, but for now, it's just the lumens option, and it's a lot more accurate. As I said previously, it's not meant to be a one-to-one simulation, but it's much easier to approximate what real lights are going to look like when working with SceneForge. So it's an approximation, not a simulation. So now we can adjust the lumen values, as well as the light temperature, and any temperature presets that you want to use. So there you have it. GI/indirect lighting still works really well, and Raytrace GI also looks pretty great. Something that's important to note about Raytrace GI at the moment is that because it actually is tracing a bunch of rays, sometimes the rays have a chance to hit objects that you might not want them to. So for example, if I bring in a light bulb that needs to shoot rays from every direction, you might see this happening. So let's bring this up, turn that off, and lower the intensity. And if I turn on Raytrace GI, you see over here, there's a little bit of light that kind of leaks out there where it shouldn't be. But in most cases, when you have it up against a wall or in an actual environment, as opposed to just like an empty void, it usually is fine. But I recommend playing around with it just like anything else. Additionally, since the last update, we actually updated a bug or fixed a bug that prevented new icons from being generated when you import objects. So for example, if I click Import, Model, and I'm going to bring in let's do this mesh. That's a photo scan of a cave. It's actually pretty cool. So if I import it previously, the icon that generates, it wouldn't have the actual image of the model. So now once it's finished, you'll actually see it over there. And there we go. So because the lighting of the scene is currently dark, the background is dark. That's another thing we're working on, but we can bring it in, and there we have it. This is a photo scan of a rock from Egypt, I believe. And we can shrink this down a little bit. And there we have it. I actually highly recommend looking at different photo scans that are available on Sketchfab. On one hand, they're usually very high polygon count, so sometimes they will slow down the editor. But on the other hand, you get some really interesting, visuals here that you wouldn't be able to get from a hand-modeled object. This is unnecessarily shiny for some reason. That's also something we're working on, but you can see it's pretty cool. You can create some interesting backdrops. So that is an overview of 0.1.7. Again, it should be available by the time you're watching this video, but if not, every time you open a SceneForge, it'll check for an update and you can download it from there. Thank you very much. That's about it for this release, but there'll be more videos with every change that gets made. Thank you.